Good evening, Professor. Good evening, class. This is David Maxwell, otherwise known as Maxie. And tonight, I think it would be pretty easy choice for me to pick, but I picked Mount Vernon. The reason why I picked Mount Vernon is I've visited it quite often. It's the home of our first president. I can walk there to visit, and I'll get into that in just a moment. But the Mount Vernon estate is a actual time capsule, one that we can get a glimpse into the past of the kind of life that George Washington lived away from the public eye. Often he tried to get away from it. He was a private man, and you learn a lot about that if you visit Mount Vernon, the way he valued his privacy, but the type of things that really bothered him about his post-presidential career and up until the time he died in the late 1700s. He one time wrote that he went down for breakfast. He came down the staircase. There was a private staircase. And in the period after, there was a lot of people that came to call on George Washington. He was, of course, a famous figure, a famous war hero, a former president. And he, in the old days of the 18th century, it was very customary to give shelter to those that came calling upon your house. And George Washington had a lot of those people. He talked about his grist mill producing and his distillery producing lots of food and whiskey and wine for the visitors, thousands of liters, hundreds of pounds of food that were consumed by visitors that would sometimes stay for 7 days in his house. Uh, he spoke and he wrote about one time going down for breakfast and looking down at his food and then looking up and seeing 8 or 9 strangers looking at him, and it made him very uncomfortable. So as a private man, this is kind of a short and a glimpse into his very private life that wasn't so private. But he loved Mount Vernon. He wanted to go back to Mount Vernon. And I could see why. Living on property that was once part of the hills, or he would hunt, and I'll get into that in a moment, where in the Mount Vernon is wholly owned by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Well, shortly after his death, the house fell to his wife, and this portion of his slaves were freed, and they fled not far from Mount Vernon. They still wanted employment, but they lived in the hills around Mount Vernon, and those hills were called the Wessington Hills. I live on the Wessington Estates. So in the 1960s, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association sold tracts of property that George Washington hunted on and where the slaves, actually the freed slaves, lived, as they didn't wander that far from Mount Vernon. And I feel privileged to actually live on a small tract of land that once belonged to our first president. And I can walk to his estate whenever I would like to. Also part of Mount Vernon is the George Washington Presidential Library, which has a lot of his original artifacts. It houses a lot of his original documents, his writings, uh, everything from receipts all the way up to private correspondence between some of the founding fathers and even to some of the business he had in Alexandria. So to visit, you have to have a request put into the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, the Presidential Library, on why you need to visit. And you can get, with your student ID or another valid reason, get in to actually research some of those primary source documents, which is pretty amazing. I've been there at least 6 or 7 times in the course of being a Liberty student. Excuse me. Also on Mount Vernon, there's a host of archaeological digs that are continuing that reveal something new almost every day. Right now is not the archaeological season. Usually it's the summer when it's warmer and the ground is softer. But during the winter, they often do archaeological excavation around the house or in the basement. And a couple years ago, they found preserved cherries that were buried under one of the floorboards. But visiting Mount Vernon, one can get the sense of the type of environment that George Washington lived in, the type of visitors he received, his key that was he received from Lafayette. A lot of those original items were retrieved from the Lee House, which is up on Arlington Cemetery, the house that you see at the top of the hill. They inherited a lot of and they purchased a lot of the artifacts and the furniture and the things that you would have found at the time of George Washington's death and at the time of his wife's death. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association has been prolific at trying to go around and retrieve things from all around the country and from the Lee Estate to repopulate Mount Vernon, to make it look as it did shortly before George Washington passed away in the late 1700s. But it is an amazing place to go visit if you haven't been there before, where you can get a glimpse into the time of George Washington's life at Mount Vernon, the type of the way he treated his slaves and the way they worked on his property, the often conflicted feelings he had on that. You can explore at Mount Vernon. Uh, Everything from seeing what a bowling green looks like, which is an English style of a gentleman's house in England, to the French revivalist architecture and furniture, the colors that were used in his house, give you a sense of the man and what he was, what he tried to accomplish when visitors came calling upon him for a stately dinner. It's an insight into the man and into the time that he lived. And I feel privileged to have actually spoken here about it for just, I know, 6 minutes. So thank you for that. It was a pleasure to discuss this quite uh, quickly, but I hope I fulfilled the requirements for this assignment. I feel there's a lot that can be learned from just a short visit to Mount Vernon, into the time period, into the man, and to the politics of the period. Thank you very much. Have a good night and God bless.